On the first Sunday in November 1962, the Washington National Cathedral sponsored the first Marine Corps worship service. In those 37 years, worshipers have thanked God for the role Marines have played in serving our nation. And over the years, guest speakers have charged Marines to keep on and keep going, and to pass the heritage, stories of their heroes, and their ethos from one generation to another. This year, another distinguished guest speaker graces this pulpit. He can issue such a charge to Marines with honor and integrity. He served in the Air Force over 35 years. He was interned in various prisons throughout North Vietnam from April 1966 to February 1973. A few of his awards include the Air Force Cross, Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star Medal, and the Purple Heart. It is an honor to introduce to you our guest speaker, General Chuck Boyd.
Thank you, Chaplain, for that generous introduction. My guess would be that not many of you in this congregation have ever stood in this pulpit, in this magnificent cathedral. And so I don't think you can know the feeling that I'm experiencing at the moment. And I probably lack the power of expression necessary to bring you into the pulpit with me. Awe comes to mind, and a sense of insignificance relative to the glory of the surroundings and to my task at hand. When your commandant asked me to deliver the address, he didn't call it a sermon, at this traditional service preceding the Marine Corps birthday, I thought it a bit odd. An Air Force officer, a well-used and retired one at that, delivering the address to a Marine Corps audience on their very special day. But this commandant, as so many of you must know, makes compliance with his wishes come easily for others. And so, without hesitation, I said yes. Later, when I actually began to think about what I might say to you, my earlier unease disappeared. Why should it be odd for me to speak to a Marine audience? After all, I'm a citizen, and it's therefore my Marine Corps too. More, I think, than the other of our nation's military services, the Marine Corps has come to occupy a special place in the hearts of the citizenry. We tend to think of it as our Marine Corps. And so as I think about how we can, in this cathedral today, ask God's special blessing on our Corps, I think it should be properly in a celebration of that which makes the profession of arms unique, that which makes those who follow the profession different, a difference which Marines United States Marines have embraced with unsurpassed devotion for the past 224 years. So just what is this difference? Maybe we can describe it from our literature and from our history. When I was a young man, a boy actually growing up in the presence of what Tom Brokaw now calls the greatest generation, I was an avid reader. I devoured all the great novels that emerged from the titanic struggle called World War II. The Naked and the Dead, From Here to Eternity, The Caine Mutiny, and that wonderful story of Marines' Battle Cry by Leon Uris. And then while still in high school and still reading war novels, I came upon one of the few good books to come out of the Korean War. A slim, tightly developed story told by James Michener of duty, commitment, and of sacrifice, called The Bridges of Tokori. 40-odd years later, I still remember what must have been for me an awakening to that special difference. The protagonist in the novel is a fellow named Harry Brubaker, a lawyer from Denver, married with 2 little daughters, a carrier pilot who had fought in World War II and had now been recalled, unfairly he thought, to fight again in Korea. But once there, fairly sent or not, Brubaker gave of himself without reservation, volunteering for the toughest of missions, which he could have easily ducked. His task force commander, an old admiral named Tarrant, who had lost one son at Pearl Harbor and another at Midway, developed a deep but well-masked affection for the young pilot, who could have been one of his own sons. When Brubaker's wife came to Tokyo to join her husband on a port visit and finds herself alone for a bit in the admiral's presence, she challenges the old professional to explain what to her was an incomprehensible war. Moreover, she demands to know why her husband, who has already given so much, is being used yet again. Tarrant patiently tries to explain the war, but he's at his best as he answers her second question. Her husband, he says, is one of those special men who never shrink, who never shirk, who accomplish the mission if it is humanly possible, who, and I now quote, hammer on in, even though the weight of war has fallen unfairly on them. I always think of them as the voluntary men. The world has always depended on the voluntary men. The institution we are here today to commemorate is different than it was a half or even a quarter of a century ago. Always an attraction for men of the voluntary variety. Now I think it attracts similarly inclined women as well. I watched from the bridge of the USS Eisenhower as a young female Marine first lieutenant landed her FNA-18 on that carrier deck, catching the third arresting cable in what was the most nearly perfect trap I saw that day. After her debrief, I asked her why she wanted to fly jet fighters. She replied, because I couldn't think of anything more exciting to do. I don't know, but my guess is that she may be of the voluntary kind. Hero has always been a tough word to define, and it's used so loosely these days in the civilian world as to have lost all meaning. Moreover, those I have known in my life who actually were heroes were never comfortable being called that. But whatever we choose to call them, be it hero or the voluntary men and women, it is how they serve under difficult circumstances that matters. That distinguishes them as those you can depend on, those that are, in your Corps' wonderful phrase, semper fidelis, always faithful. Some examples here might help. You know the stories, but like familiar hymns, it helps to sing them now and again. Lou Wilson, a 24-year-old company commander on Guam in 1945, wounded 3 times the day before, leapt up from his stretcher in the aid station at the outbreak of a Japanese night attack and limped back to the front to rejoin his company. Japanese troops swarmed over the position, and Wilson and his men, sometimes fighting back to back, cut them down with bayonets, rifle butts, and fighting knives. Spotting one of his men surrounded by Japanese 50 yards away, Wilson painfully dashed out, swept up the Marine, and fought his way back. Late in the battle, the Japanese seized a prominent hill nearby and raked Wilson's position with automatic fire. The captain quickly chose 17 men to follow him in a storming mission up the slope. Their charge was near suicidal. 14 Marines fell, but Wilson and the survivors reached the crest and subdued the machine gunners. Dawn found him still on his feet in the high ground. You must remember with honor your 26th Commandant. Then there's the story of the indefatigable young Marine Lieutenant, John Leeper, who after shooting down 2 Japanese bombers near Okinawa was returning to base when he was jumped by an enemy fighter plane. Maneuvering into position, he fired his remaining few rounds of ammunition, then literally pulled up behind the aircraft and attacked with his propeller. Well, Leeper got his man in what was never to become an approved technique in fighter tactics. And although he ended up in the water himself, he lived to fly another day. This was a voluntary man. My own favorite Marine was a fellow named John Frederick, a warrant officer with whom I shared a small cell for a while in a prison called San Tay in North Vietnam. When I knew him, John was fighting his 4th war. He had enlisted in August of '42, fought his way through the Pacific Islands as an infantryman, then again in China with a small contingent of Marines prior to the fall of Chiang Kai-shek. He next fought in Korea as a radar operator in F-7Fs, as I recall, and was shot down over North Vietnam in the back seat of an F-4. His hands and forearms had been badly burned before ejecting, and after capture without proper medical attention, his fingers had grown together in the healing process. He thus had 2 movable paddles on the end of his arms, and we used to joke about what an advantage that would give him in swimming when we returned home after the war. John was a taciturn man, deeply religious, respectful of other people's sensitivities, a valued cellmate who passed his time and kept his sanity by pacing in his short walk space all day and counting the steps. 90,000 was not uncommon, and 132,000, if memory serves, was his personal best. He did not go out of his way to provoke his captors, but was a fierce resistor when they tried to get anything from him. For me, John Frederick was a symbol of quiet stoicism, an utterly dependable comrade-at-arms who would be there when you needed him, no matter the risk. We left him in North Vietnam, dead of some unidentified disease, a few months before our release, and I'll never forget him. Although it would seem a stretch at first glance, there is, to my mind, a certain similarity between John and Senator John Chafee, another Marine who left us this past week. Senator John Warner, also a Marine, told of a recent conversation with Senator Chafee in which the subject of combat decorations came up. Warner asked, "Did you ever get a decoration besides the Purple Heart?" "No," he replied. "Didn't deserve it, didn't get it." This, mind you, from a man who left Yale to enlist in the Marines, fought on Guadalcanal, was selected for officer training, was a platoon leader on Okinawa in some of the heaviest fighting of the war. Then, after finishing undergraduate work on a Yale law degree, he returned to the Marines to command a company in Korea. Didn't deserve a medal? John Frederick would have said the same. Voluntary men, both. One last vignette, perhaps the ultimate example of the voluntary man. Colonel Michael Fenton, regimental commander, leading his troops in the attack on Okinawa, left his post long enough to kneel on the beach and say a prayer over his son, Private First Class Michael Fenton, Jr., a member of his regiment, killed in the assault, then returned to lead the continuing attack. On the final page of Michener's book, the old admiral asks a haunting question. Brubaker has been lost, as the reader feared, pressing the attack on those bridges. And the admiral, trying to absorb yet another painful loss, wonders, why is America lucky enough to have such men? And then, where do we get such men? I think I know the answer to the admiral's questions, and you probably do too. There is something in the fertility of our national soil, fed by the nutrients of this wonderful, constantly improving experiment in democracy, that produces men and women who, when the chips are really down, somehow find their way to the recruiting offices all over this land. And then, and this is the clincher, we have noble institutions, none finer than the one we commemorate here today, that take the exquisite raw material and shape those men and women, inculcate in them the ethos of our profession, and mold them into the warriors our nation will always need. Let us look up today in our national place of worship and ask that God bless this land, that He continue to bless this land, and that He give special blessing for our nation's Marine Corps.